So today we're going to go over some lining techniques as well as creating highlight and shadow for our brick and stone project. So I've started here by putting in the horizontal lines, and I'm using a scenic fitch as opposed to the sash brush because this allows me to do the entire width of the line with one brush stroke, which is going to save me a lot of time. So you can see I can get a really nice, this is about a 1/2 inch wide line, and it just takes me one brush stroke. If I get my brush loaded well, I can do it in one fell swoop, right? So this is the best way to try to do this. You will want to practice with the scenic fitch before you go into using this directly on your flat, because it does take a little bit of practice to get the right amount of pressure to get the width of line that you want. And this line I had to go over a few times, but you get the idea here. Now, if you are going to use a sash brush, the trick is you're going to have to line up your lining straight edge on both sides of the line. And because we've got wet paint on the line below it, I have to now line it up so that I'm painting on this side of the line between the line and the straight edge, which can get a little bit tricky. Again, if this is the way you feel like you need to do this, you'll need to do a little bit of practicing first, but you can do it this way. The problem is it takes you twice as long because you're lining up your straight edge twice as many times. So basically painting half the line and then coming back in and painting the other half of the line and then filling in any gaps that might be left in between there. It is possible, but it's just not a very efficient way of doing it. As you're doing this with the lining straight edge, obviously you want to keep your straight edge out of your wet paint. So that's the main thing. With a flat this size, that pretty much means painting in one direction. So you could start at the top and work your way down. You can start at the bottom and work your way up. It doesn't really matter, but you do need to just go in consecutive order. So I finished off my horizontals, and now I have this little bit at the bottom here where I just need to touch up a little bit because I didn't quite get my brick texture all the way down. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking the two colors that I originally used, which was the brick red and that kind of goldish dark gold color. And I'm just filling in, I'm using a fitch again, and I'm kind of dabbing it in so that I get a little bit of irregularity. I'm mixing the two colors together, doing a little bit of a sort of stipple, scumble kind of thing. And then I'm going to come back in with some water, and I'm going to use that water just to feather out that edge. What this should do is, because this is the very bottom of this, I'm not going to worry too much about like recreating the texture exactly. I can just kind of feather it out and it should blend in. So next we're going to do our vertical lines. And here again, it's the exact same technique, but you just want to be really careful that you're getting, even though it's a very short line, you want to make sure that that consistency, that width of that line stays the same all the way through the line, even though it's just a little short line. You don't want it to get skinny on either end and sort of have a kind of oblong shape in the middle. So again, just practice a little bit with getting that brush stroke going, and you want to keep your brush pretty, sort of square down and keep your pressure really even throughout the entirety of the brush stroke. Also make sure that your lines are connecting into one another. You don't want any gaps in between your bricks where your mortar doesn't quite match up. The mortar technique on the stone is very much similar. You're going to use, I'm using the same scenic fitch again because I now have this feel of the amount of pressure to keep that mortar line relatively consistent. Here I want a little bit of variation, so you can kind of see I'm sort of twisting the brush just a little bit so that I am actually getting a little bit of variation in the width of the line. I don't want a huge amount, but just a little bit. And here again, you can use the lines that you've already drawn in as a guideline. You don't have to be real precise with these if they're, if you don't quite match up exactly what you've drawn. It's okay as long as it still looks okay. So just keep going with that. Keep your brush hold your brush loosely and just continue with those lines, kind of using the pressure and using the twisting of the brush to create some variation in that line. So the last step on the mortar is just to clean up this last line that lives underneath the bricks. That needs to be a straight line, so I'm going to use my straight edge and just continue that through and then fill in any gaps, and that will be it. The next step is the shadow, which our light source is going to come from the top left. And so that means that the shadow is going to be cast into the mortar. So we want to keep our shadow line in the mortar, not on the stone. I'm starting off with the stone here just because it's a little bit more freeform. It's a little easier to get a sense of it. One thing you want to be very careful of when doing shadows is that you want the shadow color to be very transparent. You want to be able to see through it, right? If you think about how shadows actually exist, if you look at a shadow on the ground, you can see the ground through it. So if your shadow gets too opaque, it's going to look very cartoonish. It's not going to look as realistic. So you want to play around with the consistency of it, make sure it's a nice transparent color. I've actually added some clear acrylic glaze into this. I'll show you that in class. And that is just because sometimes if you just thin it with water, there's not enough body to it. It gets very runny and it wants to sort of bleed out, and we don't want that. We want it to still stay in place. So we use the clear acrylic to add transparency without adding fluidity to it. The other thing you want to be careful of with this is where your shadows stop and start. So when you start a shadow, you want to hold it back from the corner just a little bit. That gives you a little bit more of a sense of light coming in from an angle. With the shadows on the bricks, we've got the same thing. We've got our light coming in. So our highlight's going to catch that top edge of the brick, and then our shadow is going to catch underneath. So we want to keep our highlight on the brick and our shadow in the mortar. This is the same thing we did with the stone, right? So think about where the light is coming from, what the angle is. So I've lined up my straight edge here, and I'm putting my straight edge over the brick because I want the shadow line to go into the mortar. So I'm going to cover up the thing that I don't want the shadow in. So I'm going to cover up the brick with the lining stick, and I'm going to paint into the mortar, right? And I'm looking at about 1/4 of an inch or less line. I don't want those lines to get too terribly thick. But I'm going to go ahead and do those lines across there. I'm holding these back from the corner so they start just a touch back from the edge of the brick. Okay, you can see that kind of here. The shadow line actually starts about somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of an inch in from the end of the brick where I'm starting. So I'm going to do all of these horizontals again. You do have to be very careful. It's probably easier if you stand on the side of the lining stick where you can see where those bricks stop and start, because you do want to get a nice clean termination on the end. You don't want to go past the end of the brick on your brush stroke. So you're starting just a hair back from that edge of the brick and you're ending right on the other corner. Okay. I want to make sure that I get really clean corners where the two shadow lines meet, the horizontal and the vertical. Normally I would continue on and finish out all my horizontals, but for purposes of demonstration, I'm going to do some of the verticals as well. So I want to make sure that, again, I'm not starting right at the top corner. I'm kind of starting back, just holding it back just a little bit, and then making a nice clean corner where those two lines meet. The width of your shadow is going to indicate how far your brick sticks out from the mortar. So you don't want to let it get too thick, because if you think about how bricks usually stick out from mortar, right? They don't stick out a huge amount. If you make your shadow too thick, it's going to look like your brick is standing way forward of your mortar. You don't want that. So we're going to move on to highlight now. And the highlight obviously goes opposite of the shadow, and it will go onto the brick, not in the mortar. So now I'm covering up my mortar with my straight edge, and I'm putting my highlight on the brick itself. You want to make sure that, again, you sort of, in this case, we start at the corner, but we end a little bit before we get to the end of the brick. That, again, is helping us create that illusion of light coming in from an angle. For the purposes of this project, we're going to assume that our bricks are fairly smooth, so you can just do a straight highlight across. If you wanted bricks that looked a little bit more jagged, then you could use a line that's a little more broken up. But for this project, we'll just do a straight line. We'll assume that our bricks are cut nice and clean. So again, we're going to do all of our horizontal lines, and then we'll do our vertical lines and continue on with those. Again, making sure that those corners really attach where those two lines are supposed to meet. So making sure that there's a nice clean corner there. You don't want to go off of the brick. You want to make sure that the highlight stays on the brick. So highlight stays on the brick, shadow is on the mortar, right? Can't repeat that often enough. Highlight on brick, shadow on mortar. Our highlight is going to be a nice warm color. This is kind of a nice light, bright yellow. It's also much more opaque than our shadow color. So our shadow color is nice and cool, and our highlight is a nice warm color. We want that contrast. So here you can see I've held back those corners on the highlight, and then the corners are held back on the shadow as well. So finally, we're going to do the highlight on the stones. Now with this one, again, we want it to be on the stone, not in the mortar. And you can be a little more hit and miss with these because the stones we do assume have sort of a rough edge to them. So you don't have to do a consistent line. You do want to keep your highlight lines fairly thin throughout, even on the brick, actually especially on the brick. Don't let those highlight lines get too wide. It will really mess with the realism of the look. So, but here you can see on the stones, I'm doing a little bit of kind of hit and miss and varying the line again. Whereas on the brick, I made nice, consistent, straight lines. Here I can be a little more, there's some places where maybe the highlight is not catching because there's a divot in the stone or something like that. And so you can vary that a little bit more on the stones. And that is the end of this video on lining.